Welcome to the lecture for Psych 350. We'll be talking about research that's relevant to the humanistic approach to understanding personality. Okay, we'll start off talking about self-disclosure. And self-disclosure is relevant to the humanistic approach in many ways. One of the things that I always think of when thinking about self-disclosure in humanism is the emphasis that the humanists put on genuineness, right? Seeing it as a key aspect of healthy relationships. And frequently we think about this being, okay, yeah, that's an important part of therapeutic relationships. But really, if you pay attention, you see that they're talking about how any relationship can be therapeutic, can be growth promoting, right? Outside of therapy, the way you are with your kids, your spouse, your friends, if you have those characteristics of genuineness, empathy, unconditional positive regard, you'll promote growth in them and in yourself. And to be genuine requires self-disclosure, right? So it makes sense. Okay, well, let's look at the research on, well, what do we know about self-disclosure? Does it seem to be good for you? And do people do it outside of therapy? And yeah, of course, it seems to be a naturally occurring thing that people, they don't just go up and tell strangers their deepest, darkest secrets. And if they do, we think something's wrong. But we do engage in this interpersonal process, which we talk about as being disclosure reciprocity. Right? There's this unwritten social rule that if I share a little bit of myself with you, you communicate to me that you're receptive of it and and accepting of me by reciprocating and sharing a little bit of yourself with me. And what happens if that occurs, I share with you and you share with me in kind, so at a similar level of intimacy, maybe a little higher, maybe a little lower, but in the same ballpark, then as we continue to interact, we'll get to the depth of our sharing, the depth of the intimacy will increase. Right? And this in a moment-to-moment conversation. As you're going through the conversation, you initially talk about surface level things and start to move toward more intimate things. If, again, it takes two to tango for this process to happen. It's not an individual phenomenon. There has to be receptiveness on the part of one person, and then reciprocation, and then it goes back and forth. Right. So when that happens, trust and attraction are promoted. So it's probably one of the things that leads to the ratcheting up of intimacy, because once you share with somebody and they share with you, now you find them more trustworthy and more attractive. And now that they're more trustworthy and you kind of like them better, it feels safer to share more, and then so you're ratcheting up as you go along. And if your disclosure isn't met with a receptive response, then obviously it doesn't lead to an increase in liking, and that'll probably be where the relationship stops. Okay, so this idea of disclosure reciprocity in kind of an ongoing moment-to-moment conversation has to do with people generally that we're getting to know. Doesn't apply as much to our close friends, our lovers, our partners, our spouses. People who we've developed a fairly deep level of intimacy with, the rule of disclosure reciprocity is not the same. Right? If your best friend calls and says, "Oh my gosh, it was such a horrible day, I need to tell you all about it," they're not going to be offended if you don't then in turn say, "Oh, me too, let me tell you about my horrible day." In fact, they might not want to hear it right then, right? Because now there's a level of intimacy built up, and it's okay for me to share with you, it's okay for you to share with me, but we trust each other enough that we don't have to ratchet up slowly, right? Doesn't mean that reciprocity isn't important among friends and lovers. It's just not as important in that moment-to-moment conversational way. Over the long term, even after intimacy has been established, if one member of a relationship continues to self-disclose at an intimate level, and the other person stops self-disclosing, so not just in a conversation, but just never stops talking about their feelings, the relationship will suffer. Right? Because for relationships to be healthy and to work, there needs to be a perception on the parts of both individuals that there's an equal give and take. And so that reciprocity, the time frame changes for friends and lovers than from people you're getting to know. But it's still there. There's still an expectation that if I share with you, you will share with me. Just not necessarily in the same conversation. From research, we also know about the relationship between self-disclosure and gender roles. In general, women self-disclose more than men. And probably people who are score higher measures of femininity, so on the gender role of feminism, would self-disclose more than people who are lower, and people who are more masculine probably self-disclose less. Right. So there's a gender difference. There's a sex difference, and part of that seems to be because self-disclosure is in some ways tied to your gender role. And gender role is the combination of a complex interacting set of expectations the society has for you related to your biological sex. Okay, if you're a woman, you should be this way. If you're a man, you should be this way. And all those things that are this way, that's your gender role. Boys don't cry. That's a gender role thing. So for self-disclosure, the same thing, where self-disclosure is associated with the feminine gender role. So, not surprisingly, women are viewed more positively as better adjusted if they self-disclose, versus somebody self-disclosing the same exact thing or same amount. If they were a man, they'd be viewed more negatively. And the thing it goes is it's because they're violating their gender role, and that's discrepant, discordant for the world, right? That doesn't fit, and when things don't fit, we get upset. But it gets even more complicated than that, because generally women are viewed more positively for self-disclosing than men. But it can be okay for men to self-disclose if they're self-disclosing about something that's gender appropriate, right? So for a man self-disclosing about being angry at a coworker who he's competing with, okay, well, that's gender appropriate. Yeah, I really want that promotion, and he got it because he sucked up to the boss, and I'm never going to be like that, but I'm gonna beat him eventually. Okay, sharing that about yourself as a man, yeah, that seems like a stand-up guy, honest. That's good. Now, a woman who discloses that same thing, kind of aggressiveness and competition, viewed negatively because that's violating her gender role, right? Versus if we're talking about self-disclosure about feeling inadequate as a parent. Okay, now that's okay for a woman to talk about. Not so much okay for a man. He's viewed as more negatively, as less well than a woman who would talk about something that's more consistent with her gender role. That being said, we have seen increased flexibility in gender roles over the past several decades. If you look back at the older research on gender roles, and people's rating of liking and kind of basically how upset people get when reading about or viewing people who violate their gender roles. People used to get pretty upset. In more modern research, people get less upset. We don't find as big effects of gender roles as we used to. Not to say that gender roles aren't still very strong, but they're not as strong as they were. They're more flexible, where they're a bit broader. So, and obviously several social and economic things probably factoring into that. But so, just as a side note, gender roles are not by any means fixed, and so these findings may be different for future generations. Okay. What about self-disclosure of traumatic events? So talking about bad things that happened, or just things that memories, events that are associated with negative emotions, especially if they're things that you try not to think about. They're secrets, or they have any kind of shame attached to them, where you haven't shared them with others. It seems to be good for you to do that, to share. And what's really interesting, though, is that it's good to share, to self-disclose, even if it's not to another person. And a lot of this research comes out of Daryl Bim's work, who's down at UT now, I think, having people write about traumatic events or about secrets. And they can do it anonymously, where nobody will ever know it's them. So they're not really disclosing to another person, right? Where somebody connects the story with them. But the effect is still there. And the effect is not just psychological, which is important. People feel better when they self-disclose about traumatic events and events associated with negative emotion. And that's important, and that's probably why therapy is helpful for a lot of people. It also has an effect on your physical health. Right? you are physically healthier if you stop holding back and not talking about these events that are connected to negative emotions. Right? In terms of you're less likely to get sick. Oh well, you can't really study that. Some people aren't really sick; they just think they're sick. But I mean, they've gotten down to a very kind of biological level, looking at immune system response changes. Right, the number of white blood cells in your blood changes for some people after they self-disclose these negative events versus people who write about or talk about other stuff. So it changes you at a very biological level, and also, of course, because everything's connected, at a psychological level. Why is it so? Can it be so transformative? Well, the thinking is, and something that's again hard to prove, but that it's because it takes a lot of energy, psychic energy, physical energy, however you want to think about it. It takes effort, cognitive effort, to not think about these negative events. And once you stop trying to not think about something, you free up that energy to solve problems, to take care of yourself, to connect to other people. So we're getting back to getting to isolation and loneliness, right? But if you free up that energy, you can do other stuff which makes you feel better. So people that I think about the most obvious example a lot of people come to think of is, well, I guess people with PTSD, they should probably talk about the traumatic event. And yeah, that's the centerpiece of therapy for PTSD. It's processing the trauma, talking about it, because when things are traumatic, part of the definition of traumatic is the image, the idea, the memory is threatening to the self. It's painful to think of, and there's sometimes a fear of being overwhelmed. Well, I can't think about it. If I think about it, I'm just going to feel horrible, and I'm going to go nuts. I'm going to lose it, whatever. And the idea is you have to help people get past that and realize that, no, you're not going to lose. You're not going to go nuts. It's not going to destroy you. You will feel worse. Yeah, when you self-disclose, it's like, I feel so good I told you about that. No, you will feel bad initially. But the thing is, probably not as bad as you thought. And then after that initial feeling bad, after talking about, writing about the trauma, you feel better. Because again, you're freeing up those resources, physical and psychological resources. Okay, let's move on and talk about loneliness, which for the humanistic approach, one of the implicit tenets of the humanistic approach is that we are by nature social creatures. Right? There's a big emphasis, obviously, on the self, but it's not a selfish approach to human interaction, right? Because the emphasis on the self is always in the context of others. They talk about having these growth-promoting relationships, and that you can't really be self-actualized or fully functioning without connecting to and interacting with other people. It's not this kind of, go sit off in an ivory tower and become your true self. No, you become yourself by being genuine and real in the world with other people, and accepting of yourself and accepting of them. Right. So, humanistic approach, even though they don't say it often explicitly about how important a sense of connectedness is, it's there. It's in the subtext. So, if connectedness is so important, well, then obviously we expect maybe some negative corollaries of the opposite of that, which would be loneliness, a sense of disconnectedness, which we talk about it being a subjective experience, right? Loneliness can't be defined easily by simply the number of social contacts a person has, right? It's a pattern of negative affect and cognitions, the experience of which may depend on many factors: age, culture, type of relationships, and yes, also number of relationships. But two people with the same number of relationships, two people have, you say, how many close confidants do you have? People that you feel comfortable sharing with. And both people say, I've got two. One of those people could feel much more lonely than the others, right? Because they may have different needs for how many people they need to feel not lonely. And also, we don't know, okay, you say you have these two confidants, but how much do you really feel comfortable sharing with them versus somebody else? So I have two people, I can tell them anything, right? I don't feel lonely at all. I'm fully connected to people, and that's sufficient for me. So it's very much a subjective experience, which does make it a little hard to study, but nonetheless important. And you can probably imagine that your subjective experience of loneliness does respond to changes in your environment. Right? You move from one town where you have a lot of friends to another town where you have very few friends, don't know anybody. You may experience an increase in loneliness, even if you've preserved those other relationships and you can still talk to people on the phone, on the internet, whatever. You still stay in touch. It's different, and it's typical to experience an increase in loneliness in situations like that. And so we all have changes in our experiences of loneliness across our lives as our social interactions change. But it does seem to be kind of related to personality in that there seems to be a stable level of loneliness that seems to be typical for some people. So average across experiences, how lonely do you typically feel? And that seems, again, relatively stable, which makes it seem much more like an aspect of personality rather than just an emotion. Right? So people whose subjective experience is lonely all the time, people who have chronic loneliness, we can expect obviously some poor outcomes. Right? They tend to have more negative beliefs and expectations about relationships, and are less likely to self-disclose in a relationship. And given what we know about the benefits of self-disclosure, it's not surprising that high chronic loneliness is associated with worse psychological and physical outcomes. Remember, we talked before about how self-disclosure, especially for traumatic events, promotes good health. So if you're feeling really lonely and you don't feel connected to anybody, then you don't have anybody to self-disclose to. So not surprising, we see people who are lonely not living as long. Right? And that's probably, it's not that loneliness in itself kills you, but it is related to and associated with other factors, including certain behaviors. Right? People who are lonely smoke more, which smoking kills you. Loneliness is associated with, correlated with certain environments. It's usually, again, not defined by number of social contacts, but it's correlated with number of social contacts, such that people who are chronically lonely tend to report smaller groups of friends. And when you have fewer friends, that takes away one of your coping mechanisms for stress. The fewer coping mechanisms you have to deal with stress, the worse your health is going to be. And loneliness is also correlated with certain biological processes, like high blood pressure, that are associated with mortality, right, with other physical problems. So it's not good for you to be lonely. So again, I'm not saying it's not good for you to be alone, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Not good for you to feel lonely, to always experience a sense of being disconnected from others. And so if it's not good for you and it doesn't feel good, right, it tends to be associated with depression and anxiety. Why would people be lonely? Why doesn't that motivate them to go out and increase their sense of connectedness and decrease their sense of loneliness? Like most things, lots of reasons, but two categories we'll talk about. Negative expectations and lack of skills. Negative expectations for social interactions, right? They tend to have a pessimistic view of how a social interaction is going to go and tend to expect the other person to evaluate them more negatively, right? Which is similar to what we saw before with social anxiety and shyness, right? So related in some ways to that. If I think that you're going to evaluate me negatively, then I'm not going to share much with you. Certainly not going to be intimate. I'm not going to self-disclose at an intimate level, because that's risky. If I think it's going to go poorly, why would I tell you my deepest fears or hopes or desires? I'm going to have those left. I'm going to protect those. So they expect things not to go well, and whenever they get feedback, which all the feedback we get is usually some combination of positive and negative in interactions, people who are chronically lonely pick out the negative feedback more easily, and they have a harder time discerning the positive feedback. Right? So if they have them interact with somebody and say, okay, what did they do that showed you that they didn't like talking to you or weren't with you, and they can point out some things, and they might be right. But then if you say, okay, what things can you point out suggesting that they might have been interested or liked you in some way, and they'll be at a loss. Even though there may be times where, okay, the person clearly smiled when you said this, they leaned in when you were talking about this topic, they won't pick up on those things. They won't pick up on the positives, which is something that we also see with people who suffer from depression, a tendency to pick up on negative stimuli in the environment while missing out on the positive stimuli. So again, some relationships here between loneliness and the clinical experience of depression. Okay, so these negative expectations, they don't think it's going to go well. They look for the negative feedback. They see negative feedback more easily than positive feedback. And they also tend to be not as good as interacting. They tend to have a social skills deficit. One of the deficits they frequently demonstrate is in terms of disclosure reciprocity. Right? So if somebody discloses something to them, they aren't as receptive to it, and they don't return in kind. They don't disclose it themselves, again, because of that fear of being negatively evaluated. Right? So to some extent, their impaired social skills, their social skills deficit, is impacted by their expectations. Right? So they're not going to disclose as much. They're not going to talk as long. They may even be visibly uncomfortable while interacting because of the negative expectations. So in some ways, the expectations contribute to the social skills. So these things interact. But then the social skills may also contribute to the negative expectations, right? Because if they have these social deficits and they have some negative interactions, then those negative interactions reinforce or maybe even provide the foundation for their negative expectations. Well, that really didn't go well. I suck at this. I'm going to suck at it next time. Right? And then you get this feedback loop that goes on to where, okay, well, if I had this one bad experience, these few bad experiences, now I don't expect it to go well. I'm not going to try anymore, because why would I keep trying to connect to people whenever I'm obviously no good at it? So they never get a chance to improve on their social skills, because the only way to improve your social skills is to be social. It takes practice, but they won't get the practice because of the negative expectations. And the negative expectations may have come from negative experiences that were influenced by their social skill deficits. So you can see how these things are related and can tend to be self-perpetuating. Okay, so we want to talk about self-esteem, which first we need to talk about defining self-esteem, because it's thought of a lot of different ways. Here, in our personality course, when we talk about self-esteem, we talk about it as like a trait, right? So assuming that there's a relatively stable pattern of self-evaluation. Your moment-to-moment feelings about your worth or value may change in response to some environmental inputs. You get an A, I'm feeling good about myself. You get a C or an F, and wow, I don't feel good about myself right now. But overall, these positive, negative self-evaluations tend to hover around some average level. Right? So if we looked at all your evaluations across time for a year, we'll find some average where sometimes you felt better about yourself, sometimes you felt worse, but they all fluctuate around this level. And your level, your average, may be different than somebody else's, right? So it's not like there's an average. It's an individual difference. Some people have higher self-esteem than others on average. Right? So that's what we're talking about here when we talk about self-esteem. Which is obviously related to the humanistic approach, because there's such an emphasis on the self and the self-concept and how you feel about yourself, which in many ways is self-esteem. Those average self-worth evaluations reflects how you generally feel about yourself. Excuse me. So one thing that obviously influences how you feel about yourself would be failure. One thing that researchers have looked at is, well, whenever people experience failure, and usually we experimentally manipulate the failure by giving people false feedback. So regardless of how you did, we're going to tell half of you that you failed and half of you that you succeeded. And you won't know that we did that. You'll think it's really your results. So we're going to manipulate your experience of failure. But if we make people think they failed, if they went in and we measured their self-esteem before the task, right? So we're not making them fail and saying, "Oh, how do you feel?" We asked them first, look at your self-esteem. Make you think you failed. People who had low self-esteem more likely to give up and not try as hard if we give them a chance to do that task again. Okay, you failed, but here's another shot. Right? Not so with people with high self-esteem. They tried just as hard as the first time. You failed, and they go, okay, well, I'll try again. And so it doesn't affect their behavior. Right? And multiple interpretations for this, one of which is that for people who are of low self-esteem, it's the environmental input, the feedback they're getting about failure is confirming their beliefs about themselves. Okay, I didn't think I was any good, so I knew I was going to fail. Even though they may not have gone in knowing they were going to fail, but they have this background expectation. Now it's been activated, and so now if you ask me to do it again, and I've just been reminded that I'm no good at something, why try, right? And in some ways that may be protective. If I try less, then at least I won't feel quite so bad when I know I'm going to fail. I'm going to fail again, but yeah, the second time, I didn't really try though. So at least it's not as bad, right? Because if you know you're going to fail and you have low self-esteem, and you try even harder, now you're going to feel even worse if you fail again. So I'm going to protect myself by self-sabotaging and pulling back. Right? Versus people with high self-esteem, again, they try just as hard. And they also use cognitive strategies to maintain their positive view of self, and that failure feedback may be inconsistent with their view of themselves. But if they believe it's accurate for that task, one thing that they'll do, one cognitive strategy they'll use to maintain an overall positive sense of self is they'll think about their strengths in other areas. Oh yeah, I sucked at that test, but man, I'm really good at this. Right? And so because I think about how good I am at something else, you give me another chance to do the same task. I'm not threatened by it because I've buoyed myself by thinking about these other tasks. So now my effort's not going to change when you give me another chance to do it, because that's not that important to me. I'm good at this other thing, right? Which brings us to this other idea of contingencies of self-worth, right? Which aren't the same thing as conditions of worth, which we talked about before with some of Rogers' theory, which conditions of worth come from others. The contingencies of self-worth are from the self, right? They're areas that an individual uses to define their self-worth. So it's, what do I need to be good at in order to have positive self-esteem, right? So there are several different things that you can base your self-esteem on, right? And your overall self-esteem isn't an average of those. Most people pick some things, debatable whether it's at a conscious or unconscious level, but they pick certain things that, okay, well, as long as I'm getting feedback that I'm good at this, or as long as I feel good about this area of myself, then I'm good. Oh yeah, I suck at this. Yeah, no, I can't paint to save my life. But it's not important to me to paint, so I don't feel bad about myself. Right? So if I get negative feedback about failing on that task, big deal. It's not one of my contingencies of self-worth. Okay. So I said it's not the same thing as conditions of worth, but they're probably related to conditions of worth. Because they're probably influenced by conditions of worth, right? So if a dad says to his daughter, I love you, you're so pretty. Even though those may be two separate messages, they are often received as one message. I love you, you're so pretty. I love you because you're so pretty is the kind of word that gets inserted in there in your mind. Okay, so your love, my worth, is associated with my appearance, my attractiveness, right? And so to be loved by you, I need to make myself attractive. That's the condition of worth. And if that's the condition of worth for you, to be worthwhile in your eyes, I have to be this thing. It makes sense that then may become your own contingency of self-worth. So you'll adopt conditions of worth as contingencies of self-worth. Okay. We also know that people's contingencies tend to be areas that they excel at. They do well in, right? But again, to say that somebody does well in something, for many of those things, doing well involves feedback from the environment that you've done well. How do you know you're a great athlete unless people have told you you're a great athlete? So in many ways, those you could see how contingencies of self-worth might be based on conditions of self-worth. So if you're a great athlete growing up, you're a little kid and you have great athletic potential, but it's not valued by others, that may not end up becoming your own contingency of self-worth. Right? So there's a relationship there between those concepts. And what your contingencies of self-worth are seem to matter for psychological health. People whose contingencies are based on controllable things tend to have better psychological health. Right? If you base it on something like appearance, and not just appearance, but when we talk about your contingency being appearance, it's getting feedback from others that you look good. If that's the basis of your self-worth, you might be in for a rocky road, because people giving you feedback about how you look is influenced by a lot of things, many of which are beyond your control. Right? If somebody's in a bad mood that day, they may not comment on how pretty you are, on how handsome you are. Right? And there may be some days when you have a bad hair day. Right? And so if your core sense of self-worth is going up and down based on environmental feedback, that tends to be associated with poor psychological outcomes. One more thing about self-esteem. As we talked about at the beginning of this course, there's a strong Western bias in our research and in this course when talking about the psychology of people. We're talking about generally the psychology of Western people, because culture, there's important cultural variables related to self-esteem. Differences in what influences how we feel about ourselves. There are differences in how we feel about ourselves based on our culture. And again, think about that dichotomy of individualistic versus collectivistic cultures. Right? In an individualistic culture, the idea is I'm good because I do well, generally. Right? In a collectivistic culture, you may think, okay, so it's I'm good because we do well, sorta, but really, and this is hard for many of us in an individualist culture to wrap our heads around, it's not so much I'm good because we do well, it's we're good because we're in harmony. Right? So there's not even that much of an emphasis on the self, right? The self as a part of the whole, of the community, of the group. And if the group is working well together, then that's valued and that's good and that's satisfying, regardless of what's being attained. Right? It's not about getting stuff so much. It is some, but not as much as in an individualistic society where the only way to prove worth of an individual is relative to others. There's inherent competition, and for competition you must attain things. Right? It's not about being in harmony or in union with others. So a lot of stuff we've talked about regarding self-esteem and a lot of the research is limited in applicability in terms of external validity. It only applies to people who identify with an individualistic culture. Right? So does that mean that somebody of Asian descent doesn't apply to? Depends on what their culture is, right? Because remember, ethnicity and culture are not the same thing. Somebody who lives in China, it doesn't apply to them. Somebody who their great-grandparents live in China and great-grandparents moved over here, and across generations they've become more acculturated to Western society, they're probably going to be more similar in terms of measures of self-esteem to other people from our culture and now their culture because they've adopted it. So culture matters, but remember, culture isn't the same thing as ethnicity or geography. It's a bit more complicated than that. Okay, so we talked about self-disclosure, loneliness, self-esteem, and now we'll kind of circle back in some ways to loneliness. 'Cause we were talking before about how loneliness is about the subjective state and not about being alone. And solitude is about being alone, spending time alone. And there's kind of this question, well, isn't solitude a negative thing? We know loneliness is associated with negative outcomes. Well, again, we have to remember, loneliness isn't defined solely by number of social contacts. It's about a sense of connection. So you can experience periods of solitude, brief, moderate, even long periods of solitude, while maintaining a sense of connectedness. Some people can, anyway. It seems to be an individual difference. But some people, again, are able to maintain this sense of connection, and they don't require constant or even high levels of contact. So when we talk about solitude, we're talking about amounts of time spent by yourself, right? And it could be small amounts of time, just a few minutes here and there, and everybody gets small amounts. You may think, oh, geez, I'm never alone. But if you go to the bathroom, at least, you get that. But even beyond that, people spend more time alone than you might think, and we know that from some clever researchers that have come up with ways of looking at what people do, how they spend their time. They give you a pager, and then they randomly will set it off, and you write down what you're doing. And by doing that kind of moment sampling, they found, wow, people spend a good bit of time not with others. And you may not think about it because usually you're busy. You're not sitting there contemplating the meaning of life. For most of us, but you're not always around people, and that seems to be something that's valued by all people to some degree. Well, yeah, it would be hard if I could never have a minute to myself, right? And then some people prefer moderate amounts of time alone. You're talking about a couple hours set aside. Okay, well, I'm going to go do this. I'm going to shut the door to my office. Whatever, I need some downtime. And other people like even more extended amounts of time, talking about days or even weeks, kind of going on a retreat kind of thing, where needing to be by themselves for quite a bit of time. And what the research seems to suggest is that on average, a moderate amount of time of solitude has been associated with optimal well-being. Right. But that kind of on average, like many averages, obscures some important individual differences. So again, on average, a moderate amount of time by yourself is good for you. But it depends. It depends on your preference for your solitude. And preference for solitude seems to be an individual difference. So we're back to kind of this personality, how you are across time, across situations. Some people tend to have a higher preference for solitude than others. And those who prefer it enjoy their time alone more than people who don't prefer it, and they enjoy more of it. So they enjoy the longer periods than people who aren't high in preference for solitude. And that makes sense, right? So what about the time spent with others? You might think, oh, well, people who are high in solitude, they don't really like being around others. Not so much. They may be slightly less, rate those moments slightly less enjoyable than people who are low in preference for solitude, but not much. It's pretty similar. So these aren't people who are necessarily, they aren't people who are high in shyness or social anxiety or loneliness. They enjoy being around people, but they also enjoy time by themselves. Okay. So we're talking about self-disclosure, loneliness, self-esteem, solitude. Trying to put all these things together, we've talked about the humanistic view of how people interact and think about themselves, and that for optimal psychological functioning, to feel good about yourself, it's important to base your sense of self on something that's controllable. One would be that, and this is a bit of a paradox, but that your contingency of self-worth is not a contingency at all, but it's a constant. That your self-worth isn't contingent on anything, that it is immutable, right? And if you feel good about yourself, then you're probably more likely to self-disclose. And as you self-disclose, it builds intimacy in relationships. And if you do that, you experience less loneliness, which tends to be associated with better outcomes. But again, doesn't mean that you want to spend all your time with people. And that for some people, spending time alone is associated with better outcomes as well. But that's not at the sacrifice of not interacting with people at all. So having good interactions with people, but then also having quality alone time. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.